The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps as David Martinez pushed his cleaning cart down the marble corridors of Sterling and Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. The wheels squeaked with each rotation, a sound that had become the soundtrack to his daily humiliation. At 52, David's weathered hands gripped the cart handle with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned that respect wasn't given freely in places like this. The mahogany-paneled walls displayed portraits of founding partners whose stern faces seemed to judge every step David took. Persian rugs worth more than his annual salary cushioned the footsteps of lawyers in $1,000 shoes, while David's worn sneakers whispered against the cold stone floors of the service areas. This was his world now, the shadows between their light, the silence between their laughter. It hadn't always been this way. 2 years ago, David had walked these same halls as a paralegal, his pressed shirts and confident stride earning him nods of acknowledgement from colleagues. He'd been studying for the LSAT, dreaming of the day he'd trade his paralegal badge for a law degree. But dreams, David had learned, were fragile things in the face of corporate restructuring and budget cuts. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel. That way you'll always stay updated with our upcoming videos and continue discovering more fascinating stories. Now, let's begin. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows that seemed to point accusingly at David as he methodically emptied trash bins. The partners arrived like clockwork at 8:30, their designer briefcases swinging with practiced authority. David had once carried a briefcase too, filled with case files and legal research that had taken him late into the evening to complete. Now his hands carried mops and disinfectant. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in," came a voice dripping with manufactured superiority. David's shoulders tensed before he even turned around. Marcus Whitman stood in the doorway of Conference Room A, his platinum cufflinks catching the morning light like tiny mirrors reflecting his inflated ego. Marcus had been a junior associate when David worked as a paralegal, someone David had actually helped train in the intricacies of legal research. Behind Marcus stood his usual entourage, 3 other associates who laughed at his jokes whether they were funny or not, and who treated cruelty as a competitive sport. There was Jennifer Chen, whose Harvard law degree seemed to give her license for casual condescension. Robert Hayes, who measured his worth by the number of people he could look down upon, and Sarah Thompson, whose smile was as sharp as a blade and twice as cutting. "Cleaning up after your betters again, Martinez," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the particular brand of malice that only came from someone who had never known real struggle. "Tell me, do you ever miss using your brain, or have you gotten comfortable just using your hands?" The others snickered, a sound that echoed off the polished surfaces like coins dropping into a fountain of contempt. David's grip tightened on his cart handle until his knuckles showed white beneath his weathered skin. He remembered when Marcus had called him Sir, and actually listened to his suggestions on case strategy. "Some of us do honest work," David replied quietly, his voice steady despite the storm building in his chest. He'd learned that responding with anger only fed their entertainment, but silence felt too much like surrender. "Honest work," Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "That's rich coming from someone who couldn't even keep a real job. What happened, Martinez? Did the big bad legal world prove too challenging for someone with your limited education?" The words hit their mark with surgical precision. David's lack of a law degree had always been his Achilles heel in this environment, despite his intelligence and dedication. He'd been working his way through night school, building toward a future that had crumbled when the firm decided paralegals were more expensive than they were worth. Jennifer stepped forward, her designer heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. "I heard he used to think he was going to be a lawyer," she said to Marcus, as if David weren't standing right there. Can you imagine? Some people really don't know their place in the world. The conversation continued around David as if he were invisible, each comment designed to carve away another piece of his dignity. They discussed his family, how his wife had left him after the demotion, how his teenage daughter barely spoke to him anymore, embarrassed by what her father had become. They knew these details because David had once been foolish enough to consider some of these people friends. As the group finally dispersed to begin their important legal work, Marcus paused beside David's cart. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Martinez?" he whispered, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and arrogance. "I'm going places, and you're already where you belong." David watched them walk away, their laughter fading into the ambient noise of the busy law firm. He stood there for a long moment, surrounded by the tools of his degradation, feeling the weight of every humiliation that had been heaped upon him over the past 2 years. But beneath the hurt and anger, something else was stirring, something patient and calculating. That evening, as David cleaned Marcus's corner office, he noticed the case files scattered across the massive desk. Corporate acquisitions, real estate deals, intellectual property disputes, the kinds of complex legal matters that David had once helped research and analyze. His eyes moved across the documents with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood the language of law, even if he was no longer allowed to speak it professionally. In the bottom drawer of Marcus's desk, partially hidden beneath a stack of legal journals, David glimpsed something that made him pause. It was a business plan, handwritten in Marcus's distinctive scrawl, outlining a scheme to overcharge clients for services and pocket the difference. The plan detailed how to manipulate billing hours and create unnecessary legal complications to inflate fees. David's hands stilled on his cleaning cloth. In the corporate world, information was power, and power was something he'd been stripped of piece by piece. But here, in the quiet of the empty office, surrounded by the evidence of the very corruption that had destroyed his career, David began to understand that sometimes power came in unexpected forms. As he finished cleaning and prepared to leave, David's reflection caught his eye in the dark window. The man staring back at him looked tired and beaten, but there was something new in his eyes, a spark of possibility that hadn't been there that morning. Marcus and his cronies had made one crucial mistake in their campaign of humiliation. They had underestimated the man they were tearing down. 6 months had passed since that pivotal evening in Marcus's office, and David Martinez had begun to change in ways that weren't immediately visible to the casual observer. He still arrived at Sterling & Associates each morning with his squeaky cart and worn sneakers, still endured the daily parade of condescension from Marcus and his allies. But something fundamental had shifted in the way he carried himself through the world. The humiliation hadn't stopped. If anything, it had intensified as Marcus seemed to sense that his usual barbs weren't landing with quite the same devastating effect. Just last week, Marcus had organized what he called a charity drive, where associates could donate their old clothes to help David dress more professionally. The gesture had been performed with such theatrical generosity that several partners had praised Marcus for his community spirit, completely missing the cruelty embedded in the act. But David had smiled and thanked them, accepting the bag of cast-off clothing with a grace that had somehow unnerved Marcus more than anger would have. Because David had learned something that his tormentors didn't yet understand. True power often wore the mask of humility, and the most dangerous opponents were those who appeared to have already been defeated. The change had begun with observation. During his cleaning rounds, David had started to truly listen to the conversations flowing around him like background music. Partners discussed client strategies in elevators, assuming their janitor was deaf to anything more complex than floor polish instructions. Associates gossiped about ethical shortcuts and billing irregularities in break rooms. treating David like a piece of furniture that happened to mop floors. Corporate secrets spilled around him like water from a leaky faucet, and David had become very good at catching every drop. He learned about the firm's questionable accounting practices, about clients being overcharged for work performed by paralegals but billed at attorney rates, about evidence being selectively presented in cases where full disclosure might hurt the firm's interests. But information alone wasn't enough. David needed transformation, and transformation required sacrifice. He had sold his car, walking the 3 miles to work each day regardless of weather. The money had gone towards something Marcus and his cronies would never have expected from a man they'd written off as a failure: education. Not the formal kind that required admission applications and recommendation letters, but the practical kind that came from late-night hours in public libraries and online courses paid for with coins saved from lunch money. David had discovered that the digital age had democratized learning in ways that traditional gatekeepers hadn't yet fully comprehended. While Marcus was spending his evenings at trendy Manhattan bars, complaining about student loans and the pressure of billable hours, David was learning about cryptocurrency, blockchain technology, and the emerging legal frameworks surrounding digital assets. He studied financial technology, artificial intelligence applications in legal research, and the growing intersection between law and innovation. His small apartment had transformed into a command center of sorts, with second-hand computers humming quietly as they ran programs David had taught himself to write. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was becoming fluent in technologies that most of the lawyers at Sterling & Associates barely understood, despite charging clients premium rates for cutting-edge legal advice in these emerging fields. The physical transformation was subtler, but equally deliberate. David had begun working out in his apartment, using bodyweight exercises and discipline in place of expensive gym memberships. The soft edges that middle age and defeat had carved into his frame were slowly being replaced by a lean strength that came from purpose rather than vanity. His posture straightened, his movements became more controlled, and his eyes carried a focus that made the occasional observant person look twice. But it was the psychological transformation that ran deepest. Every insult from Marcus, every sneer from Jennifer, every casual dismissal from the partners had become fuel for a fire that burned with increasing intensity. David had learned to transmute humiliation into motivation, to convert each moment of degradation into hours of focused preparation for something his tormentors couldn't imagine. The breakthrough had come on a rainy Tuesday evening when David was cleaning the firm's main conference room after a particularly brutal client meeting. The partners had left behind a mess of documents related to a major corporate acquisition, papers that revealed the firm's client was using a complex web of offshore entities to avoid tax obligations and regulatory oversight. David's trained eye had quickly identified the legal vulnerabilities in the structure, flaws that could expose both the client and Sterling & Associates to significant liability if discovered by the right regulatory authorities. As David carefully photographed the documents with a phone he'd upgraded specifically for such purposes, he realized that his transformation was entering a new phase. He was no longer just gathering information. He was developing the capability to act on it. His months of technical education had given him tools that the lawyers around him didn't possess, while his insider access provided him with intelligence they would never willingly share. That night, David had created his first anonymous tip to a regulatory agency, carefully crafted to appear as if it came from a concerned whistleblower within the client's organization rather than from the firm's janitor. The investigation that followed would eventually cost Sterling & Associates their biggest client and result in a multi-million-dollar fine, though David's role would remain completely invisible. But this was just the beginning. David had realized that his position gave him something more valuable than Marcus's corner office or Jennifer's law degree, invisibility combined with access. He was the man no one noticed, moving through spaces where secrets were casually discarded like used tissues. And now he had the knowledge to understand what those secrets meant and the skills to use them strategically. As winter gave way to spring, David's daily routine remained outwardly unchanged. He arrived each morning to the same fluorescent-lit corridors, endured the same casual cruelties, and performed the same menial tasks. But beneath the surface, he was building something that would eventually reshape the lives of everyone who had chosen to see him as less than human. The morning that would later be remembered as the beginning of the end started like any other. David was emptying wastebaskets in the associate's bullpen when Marcus arrived, radiating the particular smugness that came from whatever minor victory he'd achieved the day before. "Morning, Martinez," Marcus called out with theatrical cheer. "Beautiful day to be grateful for employment, don't you think? Some people might take for granted the opportunity to serve their betters." David looked up from his work, meeting Marcus's eyes with a calm that seemed to momentarily unsettle the younger man. "Every day brings new opportunities," David replied quietly. "Sometimes they come from the most unexpected places." There was something in David's tone that made Marcus pause, a confidence that didn't quite fit with the submissive janitor he'd been tormenting for 2 years. But the moment passed, and Marcus shrugged off the strange feeling as he headed to his office to begin another day of billing clients for work that would mostly be performed by others. What Marcus didn't know was that David had spent the previous evening setting in motion a chain of events that would transform both of their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The man who had been systematically destroyed was now systematically rebuilding, not just himself, but the very foundations upon which his tormentors had built their careers. The law offices of Sterling and Associates had always operated on a rigid hierarchy, where respect flowed upward and contempt trickled down with the reliability of gravity. For 18 months, David Martinez had occupied the bottom rung of this social ladder, absorbing daily doses of humiliation with what his tormentors mistook for resignation. They couldn't see that each insult was being carefully catalogued, each cruel joke was being stored away like ammunition for a war they didn't know was coming. Spring had brought with it a subtle shift in the firm's atmosphere. Partners whispered in hushed tones about regulatory scrutiny and client losses, while associates nervously adjusted their billable hour projections. The firm's golden reputation had begun to tarnish around the edges, with investigations emerging from sources no one could identify, and problems surfacing in cases that should have been straightforward victories. Marcus Whitman remained blissfully unaware that his world was being systematically dismantled by the man whose dignity he'd been grinding under his heel for nearly 2 years. If anything, the firm's recent struggles seemed to embolden him, as if the chaos around him provided more opportunities to demonstrate his superiority over those he deemed beneath him. "Hey, Martinez," Marcus called out on a particularly busy Tuesday morning, his voice carrying the familiar edge of manufactured authority. David was restocking paper towels in the men's restroom, a task that required him to work around the lawyers who treated his presence like an inconvenient piece of furniture. "I need you to stay late tonight. I'm hosting some potential clients in Conference Room A, and I want everything perfect. Think you can handle that without screwing something up?" David paused in his work, meeting Marcus's gaze in the mirror above the sinks. "Of course, Mr. Whitman. I'll make sure everything meets your standards." "See that you do," Marcus replied, adjusting his tie with the preening motion of a peacock. "These clients represent a $50 million account, the kind of money that probably seems impossible to someone like you, but it's just another Tuesday for those of us who actually matter." As Marcus strode out, his expensive shoes clicking against the tile floor with practiced arrogance, David allowed himself a smile that didn't reach his eyes. What Marcus didn't realize was that his potential clients were representatives of a company that David had spent 3 months researching, a firm whose financial irregularities and regulatory violations would make association with them toxic to any reputable law practice. The meeting that evening would proceed exactly as Marcus had planned, right up until the moment when anonymous tips would reach the appropriate authorities, tips that contained detailed information about Sterling and Associates' willingness to overlook their prospective clients' questionable business practices. The resulting investigation would not only cost the firm the $50 million account, but would also trigger a review of their other client relationships. But David's war wasn't being fought only in the shadows of regulatory agencies and anonymous whistleblower reports. He had learned to weaponize the very system that had cast him aside, using the firm's own processes and procedures against them with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The previous month, David had discovered that Marcus was systematically billing clients for work performed by paralegals at attorney rates, pocketing the difference through a complex scheme involving inflated expense reports and fictional consulting fees. Rather than report this directly, David had begun documenting the pattern through his cleaning duties, photographing billing records that Marcus left carelessly scattered across his desk. The evidence was building into an irrefutable case of fraud, but David understood that timing was everything. The revelation needed to come at precisely the right moment, when it would cause maximum damage not just to Marcus, but to his network of enablers and supporters within the firm. Jennifer Chen had been the first to notice that something was different about David, though she couldn't quite articulate what had changed. During a particularly vicious attack on his intelligence and prospects, she'd caught something in his eyes that made her pause, a flicker of amusement that suggested he was listening to a joke she wasn't hearing. "You seem awfully confident for someone whose biggest achievement is learning to use industrial-strength toilet bowl cleaner," she'd said, trying to recapture the comfortable dynamic where David's humiliation was guaranteed. "Confidence comes from understanding your true position in any situation," David had replied calmly, continuing to mop the floor around her designer heels. "Sometimes people mistake their temporary advantages for permanent superiority." The comment had left Jennifer with an uneasy feeling that lasted for days, though she couldn't explain why a janitor's philosophical observation would trouble her so deeply. She began to watch David more carefully, noting the way he moved through the office with purpose rather than defeat, how he seemed to be listening to conversations with an intensity that suggested comprehension rather than mere background noise. Robert Hayes and Sarah Thompson had also begun to sense that their favorite target was somehow less satisfying than before. David's responses to their insults had become almost zen-like in their composure, as if he possessed knowledge that rendered their attacks meaningless. This only seemed to increase their cruelty, as predators often become more vicious when they sense their prey slipping away from them. But David welcomed their escalating attacks because each new cruelty created additional evidence of the toxic work environment that Sterling and Associates had allowed to flourish. His phone, now equipped with high-quality recording capabilities, captured every incident of harassment and discrimination. His detailed logs documented patterns of behavior that would be of great interest to employment lawyers and civil rights organizations. The beauty of David's approach was its invisibility. While Marcus and his allies focused on their daily rituals of degradation, they remained completely oblivious to the careful construction taking place around them. David was building cases the way he'd once helped build legal arguments as a paralegal, methodically, thoroughly, and with an eye toward creating unassailable conclusions. His technical education had proven invaluable in ways that went far beyond simple documentation. David had learned to use social engineering techniques to gather information, presenting himself as a cleaning contractor, seeking references while actually investigating the personal vulnerabilities of his tormentors. He'd discovered Marcus's gambling debts, Jennifer's bar examination irregularities, Robert's inappropriate relationships with junior staff, and Sarah's substance abuse problems that she'd managed to keep hidden from firm leadership. Each piece of information was a potential pressure point, a way to apply leverage when the time was right. But David wasn't interested in simple blackmail or petty revenge. His vision was far more comprehensive. The complete dismantling of the system that had not only destroyed his career, but had allowed people like Marcus to thrive through the systematic degradation of others. As autumn approached, the firm's problems were becoming impossible to ignore. Client complaints were increasing, regulatory investigations were multiplying, and staff morale was plummeting as rumors of layoffs and partnership changes circulated through the corridors. The partners were beginning to ask hard questions about how so many problems could emerge simultaneously, but their investigation led them in circles, chasing shadows and coincidences that never quite resolved into clear answers. David continued his daily routine with the same methodical precision, cleaning offices and emptying trash, while the world he was systematically destroying carried on around him. But now there were moments when he caught Marcus looking at him with a puzzled expression, as if some primitive instinct was warning him that danger was closer than he realized. The confrontation that would mark the beginning of the end came on a grey October morning, when Marcus arrived at work to find that his corner office had been accidentally flooded by a burst pipe overnight. The water damage was extensive, requiring his files and equipment to be moved to a temporary workspace while repairs were completed. "This is unacceptable," Marcus screamed at David, who was methodically mopping up the water damage. "You people can't do anything right. This is probably your fault somehow. Too stupid to notice a leak before it becomes a disaster." David paused in his work, straightening slowly until he stood at his full height, meeting Marcus's furious gaze with eyes that held depths the younger man had never bothered to notice before. "Sometimes," David said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Marcus involuntarily step back, "the most devastating floods begin with just a tiny crack that nobody thinks is worth their attention." For a moment, the two men faced each other in the damaged office, separated by more than just social status or professional hierarchy. Marcus found himself looking into the eyes of someone he'd never truly seen before, and what he saw there made something cold and primitive crawl up his spine. Then the moment passed, David returned to his mopping, and Marcus convinced himself that he'd imagined the entire encounter. But deep in his subconscious, alarm bells were beginning to ring with increasing urgency, warning him that the man he'd been systematically destroying might be far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The winter air in Manhattan carried a sharpness that seemed to cut through the walls of Sterling and Associates, mirroring the increasing tension that permeated every floor of the prestigious law firm. What had once been a smoothly operating machine of legal expertise and corporate influence was now showing signs of systemic breakdown, with problems emerging faster than solutions could be implemented. David Martinez had become a master of his invisible war, orchestrating chaos with the precision of a conductor, leading a symphony of destruction. Each morning, he arrived at the firm with his squeaky cart and humble demeanor, but beneath the surface, he was coordinating multiple fronts in a campaign that was slowly strangling the institution that had discarded him so callously. The partners held emergency meetings behind closed doors, their voices rising in frustration as they tried to understand how their carefully constructed empire was crumbling around them. Client defections were accelerating, regulatory investigations were expanding, and internal audits were revealing financial irregularities that no one could adequately explain. The firm's reputation, built over decades of careful cultivation, was being systematically dismantled by forces they couldn't identify or counter. Marcus Whitman had begun to show signs of strain that went beyond mere professional pressure. The confident swagger that had once defined his interactions with subordinates was being replaced by a nervous energy that made him snap at colleagues and lash out more viciously at David during their daily encounters. His gambling debts, carefully hidden from firm leadership, had grown to dangerous proportions as he tried to maintain his lifestyle, while his performance bonuses disappeared, along with the clients he could no longer retain. "You know what your problem is, Martinez," Marcus said one morning, cornering David in the supply closet with an aggression that seemed designed to reassure himself more than intimidate his target. "You're too comfortable being a nobody. Some people are meant to serve and others are meant to lead. It's the natural order of things." David continued organizing cleaning supplies with methodical precision, his movements calm and purposeful. "I've learned that positions in any hierarchy can change very quickly," he replied without looking up. "Today's leader might find themselves in a very different situation tomorrow." The comment hit Marcus with unexpected force, triggering the same primitive warning signals that had been growing stronger in recent weeks. There was something about David's composure that felt increasingly unnatural, as if he possessed knowledge that rendered Marcus's threats and insults meaningless. The janitor, who had once flinched at every cruel word, now seemed to exist in a bubble of untouchable serenity. "Are you threatening me?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising to a pitch that attracted attention from passing associates. "Because if you think some pathetic janitor can intimidate me, you're even stupider than I thought." David finally looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes with a gaze that held depths the younger man couldn't fathom. "I never threaten anyone, Mr. Whitman. I simply observe that circumstances can change in ways we don't expect, often because of decisions we made when we thought we were untouchable." The exchange left Marcus with a feeling of unease that persisted throughout the day, like a splinter under the skin that couldn't be removed. He found himself watching David more carefully, noting things he'd never bothered to observe before. The way the janitor moved with purpose rather than resignation, how he seemed to be listening to conversations with an intensity that suggested genuine comprehension rather than mere background presence. But Marcus's growing paranoia was just one thread in the tapestry of destruction that David was weaving throughout the firm. Jennifer Chen was dealing with her own crisis as questions arose about her bar examination scores and the authenticity of her law school transcripts. Robert Hayes was facing an internal investigation regarding inappropriate relationships with junior staff members, while Sarah Thompson was struggling to conceal her substance abuse problems as they began to affect her work performance. Each of David's tormentors was discovering that the comfortable world they'd built on the foundation of other people's humiliation was less stable than they'd imagined. The information David had gathered during months of careful observation was being released strategically through anonymous tips and carefully placed evidence that appeared to come from multiple independent sources. The firm's IT department had been particularly puzzled by a series of security breaches that seemed to target specific files and communications. Despite extensive investigation, they couldn't determine how sensitive information was being accessed and distributed to competitors and regulatory agencies. What they didn't know was that David's technical education had given him capabilities that went far beyond their standard security protocols, allowing him to move through their systems like a ghost in the machine. David's transformation was now complete in ways that went far beyond the physical and intellectual improvements he'd cultivated over the past 18 months. He had developed the patience of a predator, the strategic thinking of a general, and the moral clarity of someone who understood that justice, sometimes required methods that conventional society couldn't acknowledge or approve. The turning point came on a snowy February morning when David arrived at work to find the firm in complete chaos. News reports were playing on televisions throughout the building, revealing that Sterling & Associates was the subject of a massive federal investigation involving money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges. FBI agents were arriving with search warrants, and partners were being escorted from the building in handcuffs. Marcus stood in the lobby, his face pale with shock as he watched his carefully constructed career dissolve in real time. The $50 million client meeting that he'd been so proud of had led to an investigation that revealed the firm's willingness to ignore their clients' criminal activities in exchange for substantial fees. The evidence against them was overwhelming, detailed, and appeared to have been compiled by someone with intimate knowledge of their operations. As David moved through the chaos with his cleaning cart, maintaining his role even as the world around him crumbled, Marcus suddenly grabbed his arm with desperate strength. "This is your fault somehow," Marcus hissed, his eyes wild with the kind of panic that comes when someone realizes their entire worldview is collapsing. "I don't know how, but you did this. You've been planning something." David looked down at the hand gripping his arm, then back up at Marcus's face with an expression of mild curiosity. "I think you're under a great deal of stress, Mr. Whitman. Perhaps you should speak with one of the employee assistance counselors." "Don't play dumb with me," Marcus shouted, attracting the attention of FBI agents who were now looking in their direction. "You're not who you pretend to be. Nobody could take what we put you through and just smile about it unless they were planning something." David gently removed Marcus's hand from his arm, his touch surprisingly firm despite his seemingly frail appearance. "I've never pretended to be anyone other than myself," he said calmly. "But I think you might be surprised by how much you don't really know about the people you've chosen to dismiss as insignificant." As FBI agents approached to investigate the disturbance, Marcus found himself being questioned about his outburst, while David simply continued with his cleaning duties, moving through the chaos like a man who had expected exactly this outcome. The janitor, who had been invisible for 2 years, was still invisible, even as the institution around him collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. But David's war was far from over. The destruction of Sterling & Associates was just the opening movement in a much larger composition, one that would ultimately reveal the true cost of systematic cruelty and the dangerous assumptions people made about those they believed they could destroy without consequences. As Marcus was led away for questioning, his career and reputation in ruins, David continued methodically cleaning up the debris left behind by the FBI search. There was something poetic about it. The man who had been reduced to cleaning up other people's messes was now literally cleaning up the mess created by their own moral failures. The storm that had been gathering for 18 months was finally breaking, but David knew that the most devastating winds were yet to come. He had learned patience from his humiliation, strategy from his invisibility, and purpose from his pain. Now it was time to show Marcus and his allies what happened when someone they'd assumed was powerless decided to reclaim their strength in ways they never could have imagined. The federal investigation into Sterling & Associates had moved with the inexorable force of a glacier, slowly grinding through decades of carefully hidden corruption and exposing the rotten foundation upon which the firm's reputation had been built. Marcus Whitman found himself at the center of a legal nightmare that seemed to expand with each passing day, as prosecutors unveiled evidence that painted him not as a rising legal star, but as a key participant in a conspiracy that had defrauded clients and regulatory agencies for years. David Martinez continued to arrive at work each morning, though the Sterling & Associates building had become a shadow of its former self. Federal marshals had seized most of the valuable assets, leaving behind empty offices and abandoned legal files that told the story of collapsed dreams and ruined careers. The few remaining staff members moved through the halls like survivors of a natural disaster, trying to understand how their seemingly stable world had been so completely destroyed. But for David, the destruction of the law firm had been merely the first act in a much more personal drama. The evidence he had been gathering for 18 months was finally being put to its intended use, and the results were more devastating than even he had anticipated. Each of his former tormentors was discovering that their cruelty had consequences that extended far beyond the walls of Sterling and Associates. Marcus's gambling debts, which he had managed to hide from firm leadership through creative accounting and fictional expense reports, were now public knowledge thanks to anonymous tips to gaming commission investigators. His scheme to bill clients for work performed by paralegals at attorney rates had resulted in federal fraud charges that carried the possibility of decades in prison. But perhaps most devastating of all was the revelation that he had been systematically sexually harassing female staff members, with David's carefully documented evidence providing prosecutors with an ironclad case for additional charges. The morning when Marcus's world finally collapsed completely started like any other day in what had become his new reality: unemployed, facing criminal charges, and watching his reputation disintegrate in real time through social media and news reports. But this particular morning brought a visitor he hadn't expected: David Martinez, standing in the lobby of Marcus's apartment building with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout 2 years of systematic abuse. "What the hell are you doing here?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking with the strain of maintaining aggression while his world crumbled around him. He looked terrible, unshaven, wearing clothes he'd clearly slept in, with the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who hadn't been eating or sleeping properly for weeks. David stood quietly in the marble lobby, dressed not in his janitor's uniform, but in a perfectly tailored business suit that transformed his entire presence. Gone was the shuffling gait and apologetic posture of the man who had cleaned Marcus's office for 2 years. In their place stood someone who commanded attention and respect, someone who looked like he belonged in boardrooms and courtrooms rather than supply closets. "I thought it was time we had a proper conversation," David said, his voice carrying an authority that made Marcus unconsciously step backward. "One where you weren't protected by your position or surrounded by your enablers." "You did this," Marcus whispered, the words emerging with the weight of dawning comprehension. "Everything that's happened to the firm to me, you orchestrated all of it." David's smile was cold and precise, containing no warmth or forgiveness. "I simply helped bring to light information that was always there, waiting for someone to care enough to look. Your downfall wasn't created by me, Marcus. It was created by you through years of decisions that prioritized your ego over basic human decency." The lobby around them seemed to fade away as Marcus finally understood the true nature of the man he had spent 2 years tormenting. David Martinez wasn't just a failed paralegal who had been reduced to menial labor. He was someone who had used that reduction as camouflage for a methodical campaign of justice that had taken down an entire law firm and destroyed the careers of everyone who had participated in his humiliation. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm exactly who I always was," David replied. "But you were so blinded by your need to feel superior that you never bothered to actually see me. You assumed that someone in my position had to be weak, stupid, and powerless. Those assumptions made you careless, and carelessness is always dangerous when dealing with someone who has nothing left to lose." David reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila envelope, holding it out toward Marcus with the same steady patience he had shown while enduring months of abuse. This contains documentation of every illegal and unethical action you've taken over the past 3 years, along with evidence of your systematic harassment of colleagues and subordinates. The prosecutors already have copies, of course, but I thought you might want to see the full scope of what you're facing. Marcus took the envelope with trembling hands, his face growing paler with each page he turned. David had been thorough. Every fraud, every bribe, every moment of cruelty had been documented with the precision of someone who understood that justice required evidence, not just righteous anger. "This is impossible," Marcus muttered, staring at photographs of documents he thought he had destroyed, recordings of conversations he was certain had been private, and financial records that traced the complex web of his illegal activities. "How did you get all of this?" "The same way you never noticed me getting it," David replied. "By being invisible to people who were convinced they were too important to worry about the opinions of someone they considered beneath them. You treated me like furniture, Marcus. Furniture that could see and hear everything but was assumed to have no intelligence or agency of its own." Marcus sank into one of the lobby's leather chairs, the envelope falling from his nerveless fingers as the full magnitude of his situation became clear. "You destroyed everything. My career, my reputation, my future. All of it's gone." "No," David said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You destroyed those things yourself through your choices and actions. I simply made sure those actions had consequences. For 2 years, you and your friends turned my humiliation into entertainment, never considering that the person you were destroying might have the intelligence and determination to fight back." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the hum of the building's heating system. Marcus stared at the scattered documents on the floor, each page representing another nail in the coffin of his former life. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice hollow with defeat. David straightened his tie with the same methodical precision he had once used to organize cleaning supplies. "Now you face the consequences of your actions, just like I had to face the consequences of yours. The difference is that my consequences were undeserved, while yours are the natural result of the choices you made." As David turned to leave, Marcus called out one final time, desperation making his voice crack. "Why? Why go to all this trouble for revenge?" David paused at the lobby entrance, his reflection visible in the glass doors as he considered the question. "This was never about revenge, Marcus. Revenge is emotional and impulsive. This was about justice, and justice requires patience, planning, and the absolute certainty that the punishment fits the crime. You taught me that powerful people only respect strength, so I became strong in ways you never bothered to notice." With those words, David Martinez walked out of Marcus Whitman's life forever, leaving behind a man who finally understood the true cost of systematic cruelty and the dangerous assumptions people made about those they believed they could destroy without consequences. The ripple effects of Sterling and Associates' collapse spread through Manhattan's legal community like a contagion, infecting every career that had been built on the foundation of the firm's corrupt practices. Jennifer Chen found herself facing disbarment proceedings as questions about her falsified credentials became public knowledge. Robert Hayes was dealing with multiple sexual harassment lawsuits that painted a picture of systematic predatory behavior spanning his entire career. Sarah Thompson had entered a rehabilitation program after her substance abuse problems became impossible to hide from law enforcement and professional oversight bodies. But David Martinez's campaign of justice extended far beyond the walls of the failed law firm. The network of cruelty that had made his humiliation possible included judges who had accepted bribes, prosecutors who had ignored evidence, and regulatory officials who had been purchased with campaign contributions and luxurious gifts. Each thread in this web of corruption was being systematically exposed through carefully orchestrated revelations that appeared to come from multiple independent sources. The transformation in David's circumstances was now complete and visible to anyone who cared to look. The man who had once pushed a squeaky cleaning cart through marble corridors now owned a successful technology consulting firm that specialized in helping corporations identify and eliminate fraud and regulatory violations. His clients included some of the same companies that had once dismissed him as insignificant, though none of them realized they were now paying premium rates for services provided by the janitor they had once ignored. David's office occupied the top floor of a glass tower in Lower Manhattan, with panoramic views of the city that had tried to break him. The irony wasn't lost on him that he could now look down on the building that had once housed Sterling and Associates, its empty windows reflecting the afternoon sun like dead eyes in a skull. But success hadn't softened David's commitment to justice or his memory of the lessons learned during his darkest period. His company employed a significant number of people who had been written off by traditional employers, former convicts seeking second chances, older workers who had been discarded by age discrimination, and others who understood what it meant to be systematically underestimated by those in power. The morning when David's victory became complete started with a phone call from a federal prosecutor who had been building cases against corrupt lawyers and judges for the past year. The evidence David had provided had been instrumental in securing convictions that would reshape the legal landscape in New York and send a clear message that systematic corruption would no longer be tolerated. "Mr. Martinez," the prosecutor said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had helped deliver long-overdue justice, "I wanted to personally thank you for your cooperation in our investigation. Without your documentation and testimony, we never would have been able to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy at Sterling and Associates." David leaned back in his executive chair, looking out at the city skyline where construction cranes worked like mechanical prayers reaching toward heaven. "I simply provided information that was already there, waiting for someone to care enough to act on it. The credit belongs to investigators like yourself who had the courage to pursue justice regardless of how powerful the targets might be. Nevertheless," the prosecutor continued, "your willingness to come forward made the difference between suspicion and conviction. Marcus Whitman received 25 years in federal prison, and the others are facing similar sentences. They'll have plenty of time to think about the consequences of their actions." After ending the call, David sat quietly in his office, processing the news that his long campaign had finally reached its conclusion. Marcus Whitman, the man who had turned humiliation into an art form and cruelty into daily entertainment, would spend the next quarter-century in a federal penitentiary, surrounded by people who had far less patience for arrogance and condescension than David had shown. But even in victory, David felt no satisfaction in Marcus's suffering. The prison sentence wasn't about revenge or the desire to see his former tormentor punished. It was about ensuring that the system that had enabled such systematic cruelty could never again operate with impunity. Justice, David had learned, was less about punishment than about prevention, less about retribution than about restoration of moral order. The intercom on David's desk buzzed softly, and his assistant announced that he had a visitor. David looked up as the door opened to reveal a woman in her 30s, professionally dressed, but carrying herself with the nervous energy of someone who had been gathering courage for weeks. "Mr. Martinez," she said tentatively. "My name is Lisa Rodriguez. I was a paralegal at Sterling and Associates until the firm was shut down. I wonder if I could speak with you for a few minutes." David gestured toward the chairs in front of his desk, studying the woman's face as she settled herself with obvious discomfort. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't immediately place where they might have encountered each other. I was there when everything happened, Lisa continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. I saw how Marcus Whitman and his friends treated you day after day, month after month. Most of us were too afraid to say anything because we needed our jobs, but we all knew it was wrong. David nodded slowly, remembering the faces of staff members who had witnessed his daily humiliation, but had remained silent out of fear or self-preservation. He felt no anger toward them. Survival instincts were natural and understandable, especially in an environment where speaking out could mean professional destruction. I want you to know, Lisa said, her voice becoming more passionate, that what you did wasn't just about getting justice for yourself. You saved a lot of other people who would have been victimized by that system if it had been allowed to continue. Marcus was already targeting junior associates and paralegals for the same kind of treatment he gave you. You stopped that from happening. The words hit David with unexpected force, reminding him that his struggle had never been purely personal. The system that had crushed him had been designed to crush others as well, and his victory had implications that extended far beyond his own restoration. There's something else, Lisa continued, reaching into her briefcase to withdraw a thick folder. Before the FBI seized everything, some of us managed to document other cases of harassment and discrimination that Marcus and his friends were involved in. We thought you should have this information, in case there are other victims who deserve justice. David accepted the folder with hands that remained steady, despite the emotional weight of what Lisa was offering. Even after achieving complete victory over his tormentors, evidence was still emerging of additional victims who deserved their own chance at justice and restoration. Thank you, David said simply, the words carrying depths of meaning that encompassed not just gratitude for the information, but appreciation for the courage it had taken Lisa to come forward. This kind of documentation can make the difference between suspicion and conviction for prosecutors who are still building cases. As Lisa prepared to leave, she turned back toward David with a question that had obviously been weighing on her mind. How did you do it? How did you survive 2 years of that treatment and still have the strength to fight back? David considered the question carefully, thinking about the long journey from humiliation to triumph that had transformed not just his circumstances, but his understanding of power, justice, and human nature. I learned that strength doesn't always look like what people expect it to look like, he said finally. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is endure until you're ready to act, and then act with such precision and preparation that your opponents never see it coming. Marcus and his friends mistook my patience for weakness, and that mistake cost them everything. Lisa nodded, understanding passing across her features like sunlight breaking through clouds. They thought they had destroyed you, but they had actually just given you time to plan their destruction. Exactly, David replied. They taught me that justice sometimes requires methods that conventional society can't acknowledge or approve. But they also taught me that no one is truly powerless as long as they're willing to be patient, observant, and absolutely committed to seeing justice done. As Lisa left his office, David returned to the folder she had provided, scanning through documentation of additional victims and violations that would require careful investigation and strategic action. His victory over Marcus and Sterling and Associates had been complete, but the work of justice was never truly finished. 6 months after the final collapse of Sterling and Associates, David Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at Columbia Law School, delivering a guest lecture on corporate ethics and the importance of treating all employees with dignity and respect. The irony of a former janitor educating future lawyers about professional conduct wasn't lost on anyone in the room, least of all David himself. The most dangerous assumption you can make in your careers, he told the attentive students, is that someone's current position reflects their capabilities, intelligence, or worth as a human being. The person you dismiss as unimportant today might be the person who determines your fate tomorrow. The lecture had become something of a legend in legal education circles, not just for its practical insights, but for the story behind the speaker. David's transformation from humiliated janitor to successful entrepreneur had become a case study in resilience, strategic thinking, and the dangerous consequences of systematic workplace abuse. But David's influence extended far beyond academic lectures and business success. The documentation he had provided to federal prosecutors had led to the largest corruption investigation in New York legal history, with over 40 lawyers, judges, and regulatory officials facing criminal charges. The cases he had built were so meticulously researched and thoroughly documented that conviction rates were approaching 100%, sending shockwaves through the legal community about the true cost of ethical violations. Marcus Whitman had been transferred to a maximum security federal prison in Pennsylvania, where his attempts to maintain his superiority complex had been quickly and brutally corrected by inmates who had little patience for arrogant lawyers. Prison records showed that he had spent most of his first year in protective custody, trying to avoid the consequences of a lifetime spent believing that his status made him untouchable. Jennifer Chen had been disbarred and was facing federal fraud charges related to her falsified credentials, while Robert Hayes was serving a 10-year sentence for sexual harassment and assault charges that had emerged from David's documentation. Sarah Thompson had completed rehabilitation but remained unemployable in the legal profession, her substance abuse problems having been too thoroughly documented to ignore. The ripple effects of David's campaign had spread far beyond his original tormentors, reaching into every corner of the corrupt network that had enabled their behavior. Judges who had accepted bribes found themselves facing impeachment proceedings. Prosecutors who had ignored evidence were being investigated by their own colleagues. Regulatory officials who had been purchased with gifts and campaign contributions were watching their careers evaporate as their conflicts of interest became public knowledge. But perhaps the most significant impact of David's victory was the cultural change it had inspired throughout the legal profession. Law firms across the country were implementing new policies designed to prevent workplace harassment and discrimination, while legal education programs were adding mandatory courses on professional ethics and the treatment of support staff. David's company had grown beyond his initial expectations, with offices in 12 cities and a client base that included Fortune 500 corporations seeking to identify and eliminate fraud before it could destroy their reputations. The business had become profitable enough to support David's true passion project, a foundation that provided legal assistance to workers who had been victimized by systematic harassment and discrimination. The foundation's offices occupied an entire floor of David's building, staffed by lawyers who understood what it meant to fight for justice when the system seemed designed to prevent it. Many of the attorneys were former victims themselves, people who had been written off by traditional employers, but had found purpose in helping others navigate the complex process of holding powerful institutions accountable for their failures. The morning that would mark the true completion of David's journey began with a visit from someone he hadn't expected to see again. Marcus's former secretary, an elderly woman named Margaret Walsh, arrived at David's office with the same nervous energy that Lisa Rodriguez had shown months earlier. "Mr. Martinez," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk with obvious discomfort, "I need to apologize for something that's been weighing on my conscience for 2 years." David studied Margaret's face, noting the lines of stress and regret that seemed to have deepened since the last time he'd seen her at Sterling and Associates. She had always been polite to him during his cleaning duties, one of the few people who had consistently treated him with basic human respect. "I knew what Marcus was doing to you," Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw how he treated you, heard the things he said, and I did nothing to stop it. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that I needed my job too much to risk confronting him, but that was cowardice, and I've regretted it every day since." David leaned back in his chair, considering the woman's words with the same careful attention he had given to every aspect of his long campaign for justice. Margaret's guilt was understandable, but misplaced. She had been trapped in the same system that had crushed him, with even less power to challenge it than he had possessed. "You don't owe me an apology," David said gently. "You were surviving in a toxic environment created by people who held all the power. Speaking out would have accomplished nothing except destroying your own career and livelihood." "But I could have done something," Margaret insisted, tears forming in her eyes. "I could have documented what was happening, or reported it to someone, or at least tried to help you in some way." David reached across his desk to offer Margaret a tissue, his expression compassionate but firm. "The system was designed to make people like you feel powerless, and people like Marcus feel invincible. Your survival in that environment wasn't cowardice. It was intelligence. The real cowardice belonged to those who had the power to stop the abuse, but chose to enable it instead." Margaret dabbed at her eyes, looking at David with an expression that mixed gratitude with continued self-recrimination. "How can you forgive so easily? After everything they put you through, how are you not consumed with anger and bitterness?" The question touched on something David had been thinking about frequently as his campaign neared its conclusion. The journey from humiliation to triumph had taught him lessons about power, justice, and human nature that went far beyond simple revenge or retribution. "Anger would have destroyed me," David replied thoughtfully. "It would have made me reckless and emotional when I needed to be patient and strategic. The goal was never to hurt Marcus and his friends. It was to ensure that the system they represented couldn't continue to function. Justice isn't about making people suffer. It's about making sure that suffering has consequences, and that those consequences prevent future victims." Margaret nodded slowly, beginning to understand the philosophical framework that had guided David's methodical campaign. "You turned your humiliation into purpose." "Exactly," David said. "They taught me that the world could be cruel and unfair, but they also taught me that cruelty and unfairness could be defeated by someone who was willing to be more patient, more thorough, and more committed to justice than they were to maintaining their power." As Margaret prepared to leave, she turned back with one final question. "What would you say to someone who's going through what you went through? Someone who feels powerless and defeated?" David stood and walked to the window overlooking the city, his reflection visible in the glass as he considered the question that had become central to his foundation's mission. "I would tell them that powerlessness is often an illusion created by people who benefit from others believing they have no options," he said finally. "Real power comes from knowledge, patience, and the absolute refusal to accept that injustice is permanent. Sometimes the most effective resistance looks like submission, and sometimes the most devastating attacks come from people who appear to have already been defeated." Margaret left David's office with a sense of closure that had been eluding her for 2 years, while David returned to his work with renewed appreciation for the journey that had brought him to this point. The boy who had once dreamed of becoming a lawyer had achieved something far more significant. He had become an agent of justice in a system that often seemed designed to prevent it. 2 years had passed since the destruction of Sterling and Associates, and David Martinez found himself in a position he could never have imagined during those dark months of daily humiliation and systematic degradation. His consulting firm had become one of the most respected names in corporate fraud prevention, while his foundation had helped hundreds of victims seek justice against powerful institutions that had assumed they were untouchable. The legal profession itself had been transformed by the scandal David had orchestrated, with new oversight mechanisms and ethical standards designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had once been considered acceptable behavior. Law schools now taught courses on the treatment of support staff, while bar associations had implemented reporting requirements that made it impossible for patterns of harassment to remain hidden. But the true measure of David's victory wasn't found in professional success or industry recognition. It was visible in the faces of people who no longer had to endure the kind of treatment he had survived. His foundation's offices were filled with clients who had once believed they had no recourse against powerful tormentors, people who were now discovering that justice was possible even when the system seemed designed to prevent it. The morning that would mark the final chapter in David's story began with a call from the federal prosecutor who had overseen the Sterling and Associates investigation. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had just achieved a victory that went beyond individual convictions to systemic change. "Mr. Martinez," she said, "I wanted to let you know that Marcus Whitman died in federal prison yesterday. The official cause was a heart attack, but the circumstances suggest that his inability to adapt to his new environment played a significant role." David received the news with the same calm composure he had maintained throughout his long campaign, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret at Marcus's passing. The man who had once seemed so powerful and untouchable had ultimately been destroyed by the same character flaws that had enabled his cruelty: arrogance, entitlement, and the inability to recognize that actions have consequences. "I appreciate you letting me know," David replied. "I hope his death serves as a reminder to others that power without responsibility and success without empathy are ultimately self-destructive." The prosecutor paused before continuing, her tone becoming more reflective. "You know, in all my years of prosecuting corruption cases, I've never seen anything quite like what you accomplished. The level of documentation, the strategic thinking, the patience required to execute such a comprehensive campaign. It was extraordinary." David looked out at the city skyline, thinking about the journey that had brought him from a squeaky cleaning cart to this moment of final resolution. "Desperation can be a powerful motivator," he said simply. "When someone has taken everything from you, you discover capabilities you never knew you possessed." After ending the call, David sat quietly in his office, processing the news that his primary tormentor was gone forever. There was a certain poetic justice in the fact that Marcus had ultimately been defeated not by David's direct action, but by his own inability to adapt when his artificial advantages were stripped away. The intercom buzzed softly, and David's assistant announced that he had a visitor, someone who had requested to see him without providing a name or stating their business. David agreed to the meeting, curious about who might seek such an anonymous consultation. When the door opened, David was surprised to see a young man in his 20s, wearing an ill-fitting suit and carrying himself with the nervous energy of someone who was desperately trying to project confidence he didn't feel. There was something familiar about his posture and expression, though David was certain they had never met. "Mr. Martinez," the young man said, extending his hand with obvious anxiety, "my name is James Whitman. Marcus Whitman was my older brother." David studied James's face, noting the family resemblance that was softened by an openness and vulnerability that Marcus had never possessed. The young man's presence in his office suggested courage and moral clarity that his brother had lacked throughout his entire career. "I'm sorry for your loss," David said, gesturing toward the chairs in front of his desk. "Please sit down." James settled himself uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with the portfolio he carried, as he struggled to find the right words for what he had come to say. "I know what my brother did to you. Not just the harassment and humiliation, but everything that led to his downfall. I've read the court documents, seen the evidence, and talked to people who worked at Sterling and Associates. David waited patiently, recognizing that James was working up the courage to say something that had obviously been weighing on his mind for months or even years. "I need you to know," James continued, his voice gaining strength, "that not everyone in my family supported what Marcus became. Our parents raised us to treat all people with respect and dignity, but somewhere along the way, Marcus decided that his success gave him license to be cruel to anyone he perceived as beneath him." The words carried a weight of family shame and personal responsibility that touched David in unexpected ways. James was seeking to distance himself from his brother's actions, while also acknowledging the impact those actions had on their victims. "Your brother's choices were his own," David replied gently. "They don't reflect on you or your family unless you choose to enable or repeat them." James nodded gratefully, then opened his portfolio to reveal a thick stack of documents. "These are legal papers transferring ownership of Marcus's assets to a victim compensation fund. Everything he accumulated through his illegal activities, the money, the property, the investments, I want it to go toward helping the people he hurt." David leaned forward, studying the documents with the careful attention of someone who had learned never to take anything at face value. The papers appeared to be genuine, representing a substantial transfer of wealth that would significantly expand the resources available to victims of workplace harassment and discrimination. "This is very generous," David said, "but you're not responsible for your brother's debts or obligations. These assets could provide financial security for your future." "I don't want anything that came from his corruption," James replied firmly. "My brother destroyed lives for money and status, and I refuse to benefit from that destruction. This is the only way I can think of to honor the people he hurt and make some small amends for the damage he caused." David felt a deep respect for the young man's moral clarity and willingness to sacrifice personal gain for ethical principles. James represented everything his brother could have been if he had chosen empathy over cruelty and justice over personal advancement. "If this is truly what you want to do," David said, "my foundation would be honored to administer these funds on behalf of Marcus's victims. We'll make sure every dollar goes toward helping people who have suffered the kind of treatment your brother inflicted on others." James signed the transfer documents with steady hands, his expression reflecting a sense of relief that came from finally being able to take positive action in response to his family's shame. As he prepared to leave, he turned back toward David with one final comment. "I want you to know that what you did, exposing the corruption, holding people accountable, fighting back when everyone assumed you were powerless, it inspired me to choose a different path than my brother took. I'm starting law school in the fall, and I plan to specialize in employment law and victim advocacy." David stood and shook James's hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who understood the true meaning of justice and was committed to serving it, regardless of personal cost. "The legal profession needs people like you," David said, "people who understand that power is a responsibility, not a privilege." As James left his office, David returned to the window overlooking the city, reflecting on the strange symmetry of the moment. Marcus Whitman's death had closed one chapter of the story, while his brother's commitment to justice was opening another. The cycle of cruelty that had defined Marcus's career was being broken by someone who had chosen to learn from his brother's mistakes rather than repeat them. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded David of the beauty that could emerge from even the darkest circumstances. His journey from humiliated janitor to successful entrepreneur and advocate for justice had been completed, but the work of justice itself would continue through people like James Whitman and the countless others who had been inspired to choose empathy over cruelty. David's phone rang, pulling him back from his contemplation. It was his daughter, calling to congratulate him on the Foundation's latest victory, a successful lawsuit against a major corporation that had been systematically discriminating against older workers. Her voice carried pride and respect that had been absent during his darkest period, when she had been too embarrassed to acknowledge their relationship. "Dad," she said, "I know I haven't always understood your choices or supported you the way I should have. But watching what you've accomplished, seeing how you turned your worst experience into something that helps other people, it's made me realize that real strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up and making sure your fall means something." The words brought tears to David's eyes, representing a restoration of family bonds that had been one of the most painful casualties of his humiliation. His daughter's respect and understanding meant more to him than any professional success or financial achievement. As David ended the call and prepared to leave his office for the evening, he took one last look around the space that represented everything he had built from the ashes of his former life. The walls were lined with letters from grateful clients, awards from legal organizations, and photographs of Foundation events where victims had found justice and restoration. But the most meaningful item in the office was a small framed photograph on his desk. A picture of himself in his janitor's uniform, taken on the day he had finally decided to fight back against the system that was destroying him. The image served as a daily reminder that true power came not from position or status, but from the courage to stand up for justice when everyone assumed you were powerless to act. David Martinez walked out of his office that evening, knowing that his transformation was complete. The man who had once been dismissed as insignificant had become a force for justice that would continue to protect others long after his own story was finished. Marcus Whitman's legacy was prison and death, while David's legacy would be measured in the lives saved and the dignity restored through his refusal to accept that cruelty was inevitable. The elevator doors closed behind him as he descended toward the street level, carrying him down from the heights he had achieved through patience, intelligence, and an absolute commitment to justice. Behind him, the lights of his Foundation's offices glowed in the darkness, beacons of hope for anyone who believed they were powerless against systematic oppression. David's victory was complete, but more importantly, it was permanent. He had proven that no one was truly powerless, as long as they were willing to be patient, observant, and absolutely committed to seeing justice done. The boy who had once dreamed of becoming a lawyer had achieved something far greater. He had become a reminder that justice was always possible, even when the system seemed designed to prevent it. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story and are passionate about this kind of content, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the upcoming videos and discover more fascinating stories. See you in the next video.